Hey, Victor, could you give me the meeting ID in the chat?
Yep, will do.
Sorry, I know I need the appropriate background. Julia, do you know where the link is to that on the SharePoint? Sorry.
I'll send it to you, Dane.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all in attendance for joining us tonight for our estuary workshop. If you don't mind giving us a few moments to let everybody else in and to make sure we have the appropriate panelists up here, would be greatly appreciated. In the meantime, please feel free to grab a water or hopefully dinner and as we get ready. Awesome. I think we might have everyone here in the panelists, and we have Les, our interpreter, as well. Looks like we're still getting attendees trickling in, but happy to start whenever you are.
Can someone send me the background? This is Dan.
I just sent it to you.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Danielle Mueller, City of Alameda. We are really excited for the material that we have to present to you tonight and to talk about adapting our shoreline for the long term. Since we are here talking about the shoreline, I do want to just acknowledge that we had a tsunami warning today. It was a surprise to all of us. Just a couple of points I wanted to make about that before we dive into the workshop. When the state received, or when the cities of Oakland and Alameda received the state's alert, the Emergency Operations Center were activated. We had emergency personnel in Alameda on the shoreline and at shoreline schools helping to ensure safety. And I just wanted to note for the public that whenever a tsunami warning is issued, it's always a good idea to stay out of the water and away from the shoreline, from beaches, harbors, marinas, and piers. And the cities will issue any further notices that are needed about relocation as soon as more information is available, but always good to move away from the shoreline. Here in Alameda, we noticed that some people tried to leave the island, and we do want to reiterate that even in the worst case event, Alameda residents should move to the center of the island around Central Avenue is the safest place to be. For both Oakland and Alameda residents, please make sure that you subscribe to AC Alert to get the most updated emergency alerts. That's at acalert.org. And we'll put that information in the chat for you. And with that, I think we're ready to get started. So I'm going to turn it over to Victor Flores to start us off with a quiz.
All right, thanks for that introduction. We do have just a quick survey for all of you to fill out. It give you a little bit of time just to get a sense of who's in the room. Just, you know, if you've been to a workshop before, what city you live in, and then we can share that in a little bit. In the meantime, while this is going on, I also just want to pass it to our interpreter Les to walk us through interpretation services for those who need it. That way we can make sure we get everybody situated in the appropriate audio channel to receive the information that they need. So Les, do you have any instructions for folks at this moment?
I think the translation might be a bit delayed. I think Les is working on it.
Okay. Les, you can message me in the chat whenever you're ready. But just for those who are in the room, we did open up interpretation services. If you look at your panel on the bottom, you can click on more, or you might see a globe that says interpretation. If you click on that, you can select the audio that you want to listen to. So either English or the original audio, which should be in English, or Spanish to receive Spanish interpretation. So I'll give you all about 30 more seconds to finish filling out that survey, and then I think we can get started. And if you have any question, I see some folks have hands up. If you have questions, you can use the Q&A function to send us questions, and then I'll work with the team to answer as many as possible. Okay, I'm going to end the poll right now. And you can all see some of the results. So thank you for filling that out. And then I think, Danielle, do you want to?
I think I'm taking things over now. Thanks so much, Victor. And thank you, Jamie, for sharing screen. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us today. My name is Lauren Bergenholtz. I'm a landscape designer with CMG Landscape Architecture. We're so excited to share updates on the Oakland Alameda Estuary project with you today, and so grateful for your participation and input. It's really wonderful to have you all here today. Before we begin, a few quick notes on today's workshop. So this meeting set up as a webinar, so that means that you do not have the ability to unmute as a participant. However, if you have questions about anything, you can use the Q&A function that Victor mentioned when we started the workshop. It's just one of your options at the very bottom of the screen. We will provide responses to your questions during dedicated question and answer sessions that will happen in the middle and the end of the presentation. And then just a quick reminder to our presenters, since we are offering this webinar in translation, just want all of us to be aware and to speak slowly whenever possible and take breaks. All right, next slide. During today's workshop, we're going to start off with an overview of the Oakland Alameda adaptation projects, followed by some background information on climate science and adaptation planning in our subregion. Then we'll have time for a brief question and answer session. After the first Q&A, we'll share adaptation design updates, starting with site analysis. We will provide information on our alternatives development and evaluation process. And then we'll get into details on the preferred concept designs for the project area. We'll close out the workshop with another question and answer session, as well as some information on next steps and upcoming events. Next slide. OAAC is led in collaboration by local city governments, public agencies, community organizations, and design, engineering, and scientific consultants. Today, you'll hear from speakers from the City of Alameda, the Hood Planning Group, Community Action for Sustainable Alameda, as well as Pathways Climate Institute and CMG Landscape Architecture. There are many other representatives from the agencies and organizations shown on this slide here in the meeting today as well, and they're all prepared to share their insight and expertise with you. Next slide. The purpose of today's workshop is first to share information on what sea level rise means for the Oakland and Alameda subregion. We will also describe some of the adaptation tools we can use to make our communities more resilient and bring about positive transformation. We're also going to share design concepts for the near-term adaptation of the Oakland Alameda Estuary and provide information on the design process and project implementation so that we can receive community input on these plans. During this workshop, we hope to answer your questions, get your input on the preferred concepts, and hear more about your concerns and aspirations for your community. And with that, I'll hand it off to Kita.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you, Lauren. So yes, hi everybody, my name is Keita Price, also known as the Hood Planner. I'm one of the community partners from Hood Planning Group, and I'm also the co-chair for the Oakland Alameda Adaptation Committee, and we call that the OAAC. And so OAAC was formed in 2021 as a coalition for shoreline communities and agency partners. And together we've been working to coordinate flood and sea level rise adaptation projects, protect and restore water quality, habitat and community resilience for Oakland and Alameda subregion. Next slide, please. Thank you. So OAAC has been working with a team of consultants, various consultants from landscape architects, climate scientists, coastal engineers, ecologists, biologists, civil and geotechnical engineers, as well as funding experts. And we've been working with these different consultants on these three projects: a sub-regional adaptation plan, a Oakland Alameda Estuary project, and the Bay Farm Island adaptation project. So again, Oakland and Alameda, we share our waterways. There's no barriers between those. So we want to make sure that we are collaborating. And that is, again, a big purpose of this group. Yesterday, we had our Bay Farm Island workshop. And if some of you were there, thanks for coming today as well. And today we are really focused on the Oakland and Alameda Estuary project. Next slide, please. So there are many other adaptation projects currently underway with other OAAC partners and community partners in our sub-region. Some examples are here. We have Sacred Spaces, which is an outdoor sanctuary at the MLK Junior Shoreline down in East Oakland. We have the San Leandro Creek Trail Greenway, which is providing access from East Oakland to the MLK shoreline. We also have the Port of Oakland's Vulnerable Assessment and Adaptation Plan, as well as the San Francisco Bay, BCDC, which is known as the SF Bay Conservation and Development Commission's Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan, and we call that the RSAP. It's a mouthful and it's a lot to consider, but we want to make sure that we're doing our diligence and making sure that we are not just leveraging the adaptation strategies, but uplifting different values across these different plans that make sense with what we're doing. Next slide, please. And so next, just want to share a little bit more of our sub-regional goals as an OAAC committee. Again, we have these shared waterways, so we want to protect our Oakland and Alameda subregion from negative effects of expected sea level rise, inland flooding, and groundwater. The different combinations of flooding that we are presented by today and in the future. We want to identify and develop multi-benefit adaptation strategies, make sure that we, again, avoiding the negative effects to our neighbor. That's why we're here collaborating together. We want to create adaptation pathways to approach different levels of sea level rise from now to the future. We want to really prioritize the enhancement of transportation, recreation, and access to our Bay Trail and our shoreline in general. Preserve our open space, and make sure that we improve the subtidal, intertidal, transitional upland habitat with nature-based solutions and some hybrid solutions as well. And definitely want to make sure that we are keeping our air quality in mind. So some hefty goals, but we've been doing it, again, by really focusing on that multi-benefit approach with our different partners. Next slide. So before I hand it off to my co-chair of the OAAC, Danielle Mueller, just want to go over a few ground rules as we get deeper into our workshop. The Q&A will be open, so we just ask in the Q&A that you handle your time listening. Make sure you engage in active listening. Seek first to understand, not to be understood. No one or two individuals should dominate the conversation. Engage in your realm of expertise. Engage in your realm of experience and expertise, and respect and engage others in theirs. Take ownership for positive outcomes. And remember, no bad ideas. Let's make this a yes and space. And with that, again, I will pass it to Danielle Mueller. Thank you.
Thank you, Keita. Again, hi, everyone. I'm Danielle Mueller. I'm the Sustainability and Resilience Manager for the City of Alameda and co-chair along with Keita of the Oakland Alameda Adaptation Committee, or OAAC. So OAAC Adapt has been working on these 3 projects over the past year. And the last time we connected with the community over the summer, we presented design alternatives for the near-term projects at the Estuary and Bay Farm Island. Since then, we've incorporated more feedback and completed another round of analysis to get to a preferred concept for each of the near-term projects. So we look forward to hearing your feedback on the preferred design concepts today, which will influence our future design development for each project. Next slide, please. We invite you to continue staying involved throughout the process. We do have some upcoming events. Please check out the OAAC Adapt website shown at the bottom of the screen for more information. Coming up in the near term, we have for the City of Alameda, Commission on Persons with Disabilities, December 11th, Planning Board, December 16th, City Council, January 21st, where we'll be further discussing these preferred design alternatives. We also have King Tides are coming back next weekend. So you can join Community Action for Sustainable Alameda at Crab Cove for a King Tide Walk. And Ninth Route and our partners at Sacred Spaces will be having further engagement events coming soon. So please stay tuned. We have lots more coming out, and you can learn more at our website, oakadapt.org. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Dr. Chris May to talk a little bit about the history of this shoreline area.
Thank you, Danielle. So you can go to the next slide. I'm Chris May. I'm with Pathways Climate Institute, and I am part of the consultant team. And I want to start by taking you back in time before anyone attending this meeting was born. So the Oakland Alameda shoreline was much different in 1895, and it has been really in a state of change for thousands of years. Humans have been involved in dramatically transforming the shoreline. And you can see that Alameda was once a peninsula connected to Oakland between the Park and High Street bridges, and Bay Farm Island was once truly an island with vast marshes between the island and Oakland. Next slide. So if we flash forward to 1969, so that's 75 years later, this area has been entirely transformed and developed. And this shows just how much we can transform the landscape over 75 years. So I want you to keep this in mind when we think about how we're going to transform this landscape moving forward into the future. Next slide. So this just gives you a side-by-side view of that same information. The historic tidal mudflats, marsh, and also open bay water areas were filled and developed into neighborhoods, businesses, the Port of Oakland, and the Oakland International Airport. But all of the areas that we filled are at the greatest risk of flooding with sea level rise. Next slide. So now that you understand a little bit about the past, let's talk about what's coming in the future. So hopefully everyone in this meeting understands that our climate is changing. And in many ways, it's changing faster than climate scientists thought it would. Our planet is getting warmer, and this is changing how all of our climate systems function. And no matter how well we think we understand what may happen in the future, Mother Nature is always full of surprises, and she usually wins. And climate change is really changing everything. We are operating under a new rule book, but we don't know all of the rules. Next slide. So there is a lot of uncertainty related to how fast sea levels could rise over the next 100 years or so. And based on the latest science, we generally use a range of 5 sea level rise scenarios from low to high. So the difference between these scenarios are related to how warm the world may get, or how well the global community may reduce greenhouse gas emissions to avoid getting to those higher levels. Based on state guidance, we usually plan for the intermediate scenario, which gets us to 3.3 feet of sea level rise at the end of the century. But we always need to keep that high scenario in mind. Because if sea level rise doesn't reach that high scenario of 6.6 to 7 feet by 2100, it still could reach that level by 2150. Next slide. So these maps show coastal flooding in our subregion for 3 different amounts of sea level rise, coupled with a 100-year coastal flood event. And as I noted earlier, the areas at risk are largely those areas that were filled to create developable land. But these maps give us more granular data on where along the shoreline the waters might overtop and how deep the floodwaters could be, so we can really brainstorm solutions. Next slide. So in addition to the high tides getting higher, rainstorms are getting more intense. And we really observed this during the 2022-2023 winter storms. And the groundwater table beneath our feet is also rising in response to sea level rise and precipitation. And all of these factors together put those low-lying coastal areas built on fill at the greatest risk. Next slide. So we want to consider all of the sources of flooding: coastal flooding with sea level rise, stormwater flooding from increased precipitation, and the rising groundwater table. So this is called combined flooding or compound flooding. If we simply built a wall around our communities to keep the bay out, without addressing stormwater and groundwater, we could unintentionally just create a bathtub that fills with water and floods us anyway. And this is not our goal. Next slide. And there are other compounding hazards we need to consider, some of which are reflected on this slide. And this doesn't even include tsunamis, which, we had our warning earlier today. But we need to consider liquefaction risks that are associated with an earthquake, and also potentially contaminated sites. All of the hazards affect the vulnerability of our communities, and each community and each neighborhood has its own unique vulnerability profile. So we really have to understand these vulnerabilities at that neighborhood scale and engage with the communities to develop solutions. Next slide. So in this workshop today, we're really focused on near-term adaptation. What do we need to do first? We're not trying to tackle the entire shoreline in one go. So our near-term adaptation options are tackling just 2 feet of sea level rise, which could occur between 2060 and 2080. This is our goal, but individual site considerations will drive how high we can adapt in the near term. However, we will always keep our longer term goal of 7 feet of sea level rise in mind. I mean, I'm only 5'4" tall, so 7 feet of sea level rise is a lot. And our goal is to adapt the shoreline in a stepwise manner over time so that we're not just cutting us off from the bay and the shoreline prematurely. Next slide. So we are starting now with immediate actions that address really urgent risks and near-term actions that can address that 2 feet of sea level rise. And as we design these adaptation strategies, we want them to be flexible to accommodate higher amounts of sea level rise. So we can start planning for the next adaptation action, that midterm adaptation action that would come next. And if we're really headed towards 7 feet of sea level rise, we also want to look towards that longer term adaptation that a future generation might need to implement. So this stepwise fashion helps us consider the uncertainties in the rate of sea level rise. So the timing of when those midterm and long-term actions need to be implemented will be based on observed and projected sea level rise over time. Next slide. So what can we do? What type of strategies are we already looking at? Next slide. So we have 3 traditional ways of adapting the shoreline to sea level rise, and each of these have different benefits and trade-offs. We can protect at our shoreline, where we do our best to protect structures in place. We can accommodate, which is where we will implement flood-proofing measures, or we also could learn to live with getting a little bit wet. Or we can retreat from the shoreline, and this is where we actually relocate structures out of harm's way. And although we may not need to retreat today, it's important to start this conversation because retreating from some locations could be part of the long-term adaptation plan. Most likely, we will use a combination of all of these approaches along our complex shoreline. Next. And we need to adapt both at the shoreline or around the shoreline for sea level rise, while we are also managing for stormwater and groundwater changes. So this is going to be a combined adaptation effort that really addresses all of the different flood hazards. Next. So this will all lead up to big changes, especially when we look at that long-term planning horizon. And these kind of changes can be really hard when we are talking about where we live, work, and play. I live in Alameda and my home is in that vulnerability zone. So I know it's hard and personal. But remember how much our landscape changed over that 75 years in the past? We can implement that scale of change again. And if we do that together in a transparent manner, our goal is to reach some good outcomes for everyone. Next. So remember, today we are really talking about the first adaptation actions, those near-term actions with the goal of addressing 2 feet of sea level rise. And we want to design them in a way that is flexible and allows for future adaptation options. And that can mean addressing higher amounts of sea level rise, but it also means giving future generation options in what they can do. We don't want to lock them into just one potential option in the future. The range of options that are available to future generations are connected to the choices we make now. So we need to design and think with that long-term planning horizon in mind. So there are many adaptation measures that we can implement to adapt our neighborhoods to this scale of change. And these are just some examples, from gray infrastructure like pump stations and seawalls to nature-based approaches like tidal marshes combined with levees. Next slide. And we have heard through our engagement efforts to date the importance of expanding opportunities to improve ecological health and providing space for habitat and wildlife. And there are already a lot of projects underway around the subregion and around the Bay that are supporting this goal, including pilot projects and longer-term studies that will really help us expand the range of feasible nature-based solutions. Next. And here are just a few examples of how we can integrate habitat and ecology into how we adapt our shoreline, often combining nature-based solutions and more engineered structures in innovative ways so we can really meet a combined set of complex goals. And with that, I would think we are going to open it up for some Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much, Chris. And thank you all for your questions in the chat. I know some of the other panelists and hosts here in the meeting have been responding in the chat, and I'm going to do my best to summarize some of the questions that we've received thus far. We will also have more time at the end of the meeting to respond. So if you don't hear your question responded to right now, we will do our best to make it to that question by the end. A couple of questions for you, Chris, just about kind of rates of sea level rise and potential impacts. First question, I've read that sea level rise is not uniform along the coastline, such as in California. Do we have indication of specific sea level rise magnitude in Northern California? Just trying to get a sense of the variability and maybe some more information on the types of data that we're using for sea level rise planning.
That's a really great question, and you are correct that sea level rise is not uniform along the coastline, but we are using the latest science from the Federal Sea Level Rise Task Force, and I was also the lead author of the Coast chapter for the National Climate Assessment, so I can assure you we are using the specific sea level rise numbers for San Francisco Bay, based on a lot of analysis that includes analysis at the Presidio tide gauge. So yes, definitely keeping this grounded in the science we have for the Bay Area and Alameda.
Great, thanks, Chris. And then maybe a slightly more specific version of this question. We're really focusing on our project area in this presentation today, but we also need to think about the rest of the Alameda coast. So do you have an estimate of how much of the Alameda coast is vulnerable to 2 feet of sea level rise? And if so, do you have any estimate of what percentage of that is part of some sort of mitigation effort?
Yeah, I did. The 3 maps that I showed areas that were vulnerable to 2 feet of sea level rise, and then 3 feet of sea level rise, and I think also 5.5 feet of sea level rise. I don't know if we could flip back to that map from earlier in the presentation, sorry. But that can help you see, yeah, I saw it there for a sec, this one. So you can see there is a lot of areas, along South Shore, shoreline, along the Fernside Boulevard area, and then also on the west end of Alameda, that will experience potential sea level rise flooding with just 2 feet of sea level rise. And so this is the level that we're trying to address now. We're talking about just one near-term action today on the estuary project for Oakland and Alameda, but we are in the process of developing the long-term plan, really looking up to those higher levels of sea level rise as well, to 5.5 and 7 feet for the entire island of Alameda. So there's a lot of work to be done. It's not going to be easy, and there will be a lot of more engagement as we move this process forward and we start talking about strategies in other parts of the shoreline.
One other question, kind of about an area outside of our current project focus. I'm curious which adaptation strategies are being implemented at Alameda Point to accommodate the new development there. I don't know, maybe Chris or Jamie or one of our City of Alameda, or Dilip, I saw you come off mute. If someone wants to provide a little bit more information on that project, that'd be very helpful.
Yeah, I can go. Yes, we were involved with 2 of the developments there, and the strategy there is they are raising the parcels. So pretty much, they have raised themselves out of the near-term sea level rise vulnerability area itself. I think they raised it about 3 feet or 3.5 feet above the 100-year tide. At which point, yes, there would be further adaptations needed, but they have left a significant amount of room to make those adaptations for the future.
Great, thank you, Dilip. All right, so maybe one final pretty big question here, and then we should move on to the next segment of our presentation. And as a reminder, we've documented all of your questions and we will be responding to the rest of them at the end. So final question, how is equity and climate justice being taken into account in the strategy and approach? So pretty big question there. Maybe I'll try to send it over to you, Chris.
Well, I think, it might also be a question for Danielle and Kita and others. I think that just the way OAC was put together and with such a focus on the community partners, having Kita co-chair the steering committee has been a really big part of, I think, addressing climate equity. So I don't know. Yeah, I might not be the best person to kick it off, but I know I am impressed with how much engagement this effort has.
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to look at the question to get technical.
I can
Into
repeat
the
it.
strategy. Yeah, which is
The question was just, how is equity and climate justice being taken into account in our approach?
for sure, yeah. We're just seeing if it was like an approach in the like projects or the OAC. But yeah, like kind of Chris said, for OAC in itself, partly how community partners got involved was to try to hold the cities accountable to more equity in terms of community partnership and involvement from the ground up. So us having a lot to do with, and not just me, Marquita, but other partners. We have tribal representatives and others at the table, not necessarily here today, and other community partners, also Greenbelt Alliance. But yeah, in terms, OAC in itself has been making sure that we keep certain equity goals and not just as a checklist and marker. At least for me, definitely making sure to hold it accountable where we can. Again, for example, making sure that we are paid partners from the beginning at these tables for these projects, which again, from the inception of talking about the projects, we've been in involvement, making sure, yes, we have leadership capacities. As we talk about governance, we know governance for the OAC and how we actually govern some of these developments that we're looking to implement moving forward. Really trying to make sure it's more than just having a seat at the table, but making sure that we as community partners, again, really have a vote where we can, even talking about what that might look like in joint power authorities. So we're talking about different strategies and ways that we can have more power and influence in a governance way, but also on a time in engagement. I'm represent Hood Planning Group, and my area is a little bit more of East Oakland, so not necessarily here, but for like the long sub-regional plan, have done more deeper engagement through sacred spaces and other projects and other workshops to get more of a holistic point of view beyond just sea level rise is coming. How should we stop it? But again, do you even know about the shoreline? How do you get there? What's your relationship to it and things like that, so we can get a better holistic view. In addition to making sure we protect the shore, but protect people in space and place. And have a few more engagements up until February to do that on the Oakland side, FYI.
And I'll just add, this is Gail Payne, City of Alameda, the project manager for these projects. Is one of my jobs is to write grants. And so what we do with grants is we add in one of the line items is capacity building and paying the community partners. So that's what we're doing with this phase, the planning phase. These are the planning stages of these grants. And then as we write more grants, we continue that paying the community partners as a line item in the grant. And it's not only for community engagement, but it's also for educational experiences and for green job training.
And last, thank you, Gail. Lastly, just wanted to add too, we talked about the intersections of the different other sub-regional plans. So the RSAP, the regional shoreline adaptation plan, has an equity component in itself that myself and other POC, Black and POC climate leaders have been a part of, to make sure that the regional shoreline plan has a equity component that this regional plan also has to follow as well. But I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Keita. I think there's a lot to say on this, and I hope we can keep folding these issues into the rest of the presentation and in the question and answer session at the end. I think we should move on to the rest of the presentation at this point. Just a quick reminder for us all to speak slowly so that Les can translate effectively. And I'll hand it off to Jamie.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lauren. Hi, everyone. I'm Jamie Phillips. I'm a landscape architect working with this team to develop the shoreline adaptation concepts in the estuary project area. Zooming in now to the estuary project area, this project is a near-term adaptation plan that's going to reduce existing and future flooding risks along the shorelines of Alameda and Oakland. This is to protect either end of the Posey and Webster tubes between Oakland and Alameda. The project area includes the Oakland shoreline from Jefferson Street to the Lake Merritt Channel. However, the Port of Oakland is also starting a similar project that includes Jack London Square. So while they're getting going on their study, our team is focused on the area from the landing residential area down to Lake Merritt Channel for the Oakland side. And then on the Alameda side, we are studying the shoreline from Bohol Circle Immigrant Park all the way to Marina Village. So we looked at the whole subregion maps earlier, but here just zooming into this area to show that this area is particularly low. There is risk for coastal flooding with today's king tides actually, so also with sea level rise. The areas on the Alameda side near the Posey tubes, very high risk for overtopping. And then the area at Lake Merritt Channel also is at risk today. Those areas are shown in the darkest blue on the map on the right. And with rising sea levels, that will also lead to rising groundwater. And so we already experienced groundwater flooding in many of these areas. And we're also very aware that many of these areas may have soil contamination. And with rising groundwater, that contamination could mobilize. And so through the course of this adaptation work, we're aware that in the areas with contamination, we may need to do soil remediation that is part of these adaptation projects going forward. It's all connected, it's very complex. But in addition to addressing the risk of sea level rise, there are opportunities in the area to expand bay habitat in the estuary and improve the ecological function of our shoreline. So one idea, because this area is fairly constrained, it's along the navigational channel, but one idea is to add living seawall function to seawalls. So this picture that's in the lower left, this is a technique where we can texture the surface of the seawall so that a diverse range of aquatic plants and animals can live there, and it adds habitat value on this kind of vertical surface. And then in some of the areas along the shoreline, we do have a little more space. So we may be able to construct some gravel and cobble slopes that create more intertidal habitat in this area, and then places for people to be able to get down to the water's edge as well. So since this summer, when we saw you all at some community workshops, we have further evaluated the alternatives that we shared, and we've refined those alternatives into design concepts. So the team looked at over 50 ways of approaching and adapting the shoreline along the estuary. We then took those alternatives and we assessed them individually relative to the OAAC project charter and the project that Keita read out at the beginning, as well as project planning principles that are part of the region. And we evaluated the alternatives relative to each other. considering how they can meet this priority evaluation criteria that we all developed together. So some of that evaluation is things like, does this provide coastal flood protection? And does this measure, is it possible for it to be a FEMA accredited coastal flood protection? Or what is the cost of this adaptation measure relative to another adaptation measure? So throughout the estuary project, we took a look at those alternatives, and then we elevated the ones that were determined to align with the OAAC charter, the project planning principles, and this priority evaluation criteria, which one was best for each zone of the shoreline. And we developed those into some recommended concepts that I'm going to share with you today. So these concepts are not fixed or final. We just have to take each step along this long path that we're on together. And this is one of the first steps toward developing these concepts. These concepts kind of meet the goals of the project, but they will require further study around feasibility and cost, and then how they're going to fit in with other plans for development and infrastructure within the region. And so I'll take you through some design concepts that are for the area in Alameda, from Mariner Square down to Marina Village. Just a reminder for those that either live there or have visited this sometimes, but what this looks like in this area. There is a continuous public path along the shoreline. Sometimes it's fairly narrow between existing buildings and structures and the water. And there's a variety of property owners as well as uses along the shoreline. Like there are some parks and public spaces, but there's also housing, the houseboat neighborhood off Barnhill Marina, and then light industrial, commercial, and marina areas. That's very diverse and a very complex shoreline. Looking at it specifically at the edge, you can see that the red is showing us the lowest point along the shoreline on this northern edge of Alameda. So that little red zone is the area that's most susceptible to coastal flooding from the shoreline overtopping. Those elevations that are there are actually below today's king tide. So it is extremely, extremely low, and that is why it's a near-term project and we are working a way to solve it. This is another view of that area to describe the concern. So down at number 1's down there, this is a very low shoreline. The high tide could overtop here, and it actually continues to be low on the way inland. So water could overtop the shoreline, flow inland along this low elevation, and then flood the entrance to the Posey tubes. So we are at this stage where we have a proposed concept for this adaptation. And so I have 2 reaches and I'm going to take you through and zoom into. So I'll show you first this western section that goes from about Cardinal Point down to the Shipways area and that upper left. Okay, zooming into this plan. Let's look first to the left side there. That is a stretch from basically Bohol Circle Immigrant Park around to Oakmont. So today, there is a seawall there today. And there's also limited space between the Oakmont residential building and the shoreline. So for this first reach, we are actually recommending a seawall. And this seawall would need to be constructed to the water side or the outside of an existing seawall that is there today. So the area is narrow and the constraint of the existing seawall kind of pushes us to recommend this. But we will say that seawalls are one of the most expensive adaptation measures. So we have tried to limit where we are proposing them. They require really extensive environmental permitting and agency coordination. And, you know, when we think about adapting further into the future, they're actually harder to adapt, or it becomes a wall that is higher and then higher than humans, and we start to disconnect ourselves from the shoreline. In this location, though, we'd be proposing one of those living seawall solutions. So we do have the ability to add some habitat and ecological value there. I'm going to go back a slide just to point this out again. So this seawall would stretch from Cardinal Point all the way around the Oakmont residential building. And again, this is primarily because how close Oakmont is to the shoreline and because of the existing seawall that's there today. So the next reach we'll look at is between these two red marks. It's the Barnhill Marina. And that is the zone that is at a very low shoreline elevation today. And what we would propose here is a levee to protect the shoreline, raising the edge of the shoreline to elevation 14. And this would protect the inland side, but this also would protect the access for those living in the Barnhill Marina floating homes so that they can have pathways and ways to get out to their homes from their parking area there. And there would be a bay trail along the top of it. And then we have a little bit of space on the water side for some intertidal habitat and some park space and pathways on the inland side. So to look at that kind of in a section, it looks like this. So we have, this is one of these areas there is physically more horizontal space between the shoreline and where any structures are in the Barnhill Marina area, which gives us a little bit more room to work. You can see this very low elevation in the lower left, elevation 7.5. And we would be needing to build this levee up to elevation 14 to protect in the near-term horizons that Chris May described, that we're protecting for 2 feet of sea level rise. And then the third reach here goes from Barnhill Marina down to the Shipways site. And here again, we have both more horizontal space between the shoreline and say the parking area at the hotel. But it also, the ground elevation comes up here as well. Ground elevation is closer to 11 or 12.5. And so the improvements do not end up needing to be as high. So here's a view, perspective view, starting to describe how when we raise this elevation from 10.5 to 14, we start to get some habitat value on the water side, and then can start to grade back into these park spaces so that the whole thing feels like a more connected and accessible public space for everyone. And then there's the Shipway site, and then another reach that we studied. I just want to mention that the Shipways site has a separate redevelopment planning project underway. They are also looking at an adaptation for that site up to elevation 14. And so we will coordinate with their proposal on both sides, tying in our improvements to theirs. So we start linking all of these together. So this is the Marina Village commercial area between Shipways and then Shoreline Park, or the Marina Village residential area. And here we're taking another approach. We have had some very preliminary conversations with the property owner. The existing buildings are very close to the shoreline, some within 10 feet. So there's very little room to fit adaptation in there other than a seawall. And so it's possible that this property could be redeveloped in the time frame that we're talking about. And this is another way to think about adaptation at the shoreline. If those existing buildings are removed, the entire site could be, the elevation of the entire site could be raised up above, up to 14 and 13, so that we are both, we're raising the whole site to protect from the sea level rise flooding. It also helps with the inland flooding the higher that you are. So this concept plan starts to propose that there would be a park along the shoreline BCDC's redevelopment guidance is that there should be 100-foot wide public access along the shoreline when there's a redevelopment project. So this starts to propose something like that here with public access, with the Bay Trail, with some habitat, gravel benches on the water side, and parks and picnic areas around there. This is a third way to think about adaptation along this shoreline. And this section is showing how we start to have more room for habitat on the water side, as well as if we're filling kind of further back, everything is higher and we're still more connected to the shoreline across that section. In Alameda, we also have put together concepts for adapting to inland flooding. So as Chris May described to us, that in addition to needing to protect the shoreline from sea level rise, we then also need to protect inland areas from rainwater that gets trapped behind that protection. So we need to add some storage capacity into our storm drain system. So we took a look at this area that is in the same area as the near-term project. This is the storm drain system watershed for this part of the island that flows through the area that we're studying. And this storm drain system today currently there's a volume of water that is not captured in today's storm drain system. So if there were a 100-year, 24-hour storm, all of that stormwater does not fit in today's system. And in addition to that, we expect that with climate change, precipitation will also increase. So we expect there to be even more stormwater that we need to manage in the future. So by thinking through this, what I'm about to propose, we're trying to build in capacity for today and in the future so that we can prevent these areas from flooding from storms, people's homes and their neighborhoods. So the idea is that we would build in areas where the storm drain system could detain water without flooding homes and neighborhoods, detain it for a certain amount of time until it stops raining, the tide goes down, and that water can be can either flow out to the bay or can be pumped out. So we did study several different areas to look for detention in this watershed. All of them have different pros and cons. Some of the existing land use, some of them are not owned by the city of Alameda. Some of them only work because of their ground surface elevations relationship to the storm drain system's invert elevations. So we took a look at all of these areas, and then we have kind of worked our way toward this collection of areas that are on city-owned land or Caltrans-owned land, so that we can start to address the near-term stormwater detention needs in this watershed. So how this system would work is that during a storm, runoff would be temporarily redirected into these basins and held here until the rainfall stops and they can flow back out. And these detention basins, they sound like infrastructure, but they are green infrastructure. And the idea is that they will be at home in a park. And the water is stored in the rock layers below in the soil, and then with some ponding. And so sometimes, you really wouldn't see water ponding here. They maybe when it's raining, it would pond, but a lot of the time, most of the water will be detained and stored below the surface. This is an example of what that might look like. And most of the time, it may look like a planting area and provide habitat for wildlife. And then when it's raining, there would be some water ponding there. And these basins are, are already working throughout the Bay Area. This is one on Yerba Buena Island. And what these look like on the surface can be designed to meet the goals or the needs of the surrounding neighborhood, or if they're in a park. And there is actually a very strong symbiosis between flood mitigation, green infrastructure, and parks. We're able to use California native plants and create habitat and biodiversity, and really just bring another level of higher quality to some parks and open space in Alameda. This is what these could look like. This is listing out the areas that we are proposing for the near-term project to get to that original 36 acre feet that we are trying to detain in the near term, but also need to remind everyone that there is going to be more water as time goes on. And so we will need to look for even more detention space in this watershed, as well as watersheds all around Alameda. Okay, and so then let's take a look at Oakland on the northern side of the estuary. Just want to remind everyone we need to look at both sides of the shoreline together, so that something we do on the Alameda side does not negatively affect the Oakland side of the estuary. And on the Oakland side, you can see that the low points in red and orange are the spots over around the estuary park, and then along the Lake Merritt Channel. And one of the most vulnerable areas is the rail line. There you see it at less than 8.0. So that the rail line could flood today at a king tide. So this part of Oakland includes the Bay Trail along the water. There's kind of flexible park spaces around it, multifamily residential and commercial buildings. This connects Jack London Square down to the west, all the way down to Estuary Park and Lake Merritt Channel down at the east end. And you can see the rail corridors there in the picture in the middle lower left, and where the channel is going under the Embarcadero Bridge. This is where there's kind of the most risk for flooding on the Oakland side of the estuary. And as I mentioned, the Port of Oakland is doing an adaptation study for their properties across Oakland. And so that also includes this area from Jefferson Street down to Alice Street. And we're coordinating with the port on their project. The city of Oakland is also working on a storm drain master plan. So that's kind of a similar analysis to what I was just describing on the Alameda side. So as the city of Oakland develops that, this adaptation project will also coordinate with what they find. And so because these other projects have parallel efforts going, just for tonight, we are focusing on the shoreline adaptation from Alice Street to Lake Merritt Channel. And if we look at Lake Merritt Channel here on the right, we see that the Estuary Park is a project that has also been underway with the city of Oakland for a while. And that Estuary Park redesign includes elevating the grade of the park up to 12.5, and then another step of future adaptation later, as well as a plan to adapt the aquatic center as sea level rise gets to the elevation that triggers that. So that part is already underway and will be part of the adaptation solution in this part of the shoreline. And then at Lake Merritt Channel, the complexity of those transportation infrastructure and the low elevation of the rail line limits the alternatives at that portion of the shoreline. So one of the concepts is to build a tide gate across the entrance to Lake Merritt Channel to prevent the rail line from back flooding into Oakland. And then an alternative approach would be to protect the rail corridor by building kind of flood walls only at the rail corridor. And if that's an option that we all think should go forward, we would then also need to build levees on both sides of the channel up to the tide gate that's at the 7th Street Bridge. So this portion of the area is super complex. And so these require a lot more additional engineering and hydrological and ecological studies to assess the feasibility so we can determine the preferred approach here. But between Alice Street and Estuary Park, the concept that is proposed makes the most of this space by adding a lot of space for intertidal habitat, and beaches on the water side, providing the bay trail across the top of the shoreline protection, and then providing parks and park amenities on the land side between the trail and the residential. So then here is a view of how this portion of this shoreline could look with the bay trail near the Landings residential building. The levee moves a little bit inland in this example. The shoreline is widened, so we have more opportunity for a variety of habitat on the shoreline side. And then lots of planting and habitat on the inland side as well. So these are the concepts, and I just want to recognize again that while this change is very daunting and this adaptation project is a huge undertaking, we really hope that the vision set forth by the OAAC, the Oakland Alameda Adaptation Committee, can be achieved. And we really hope that together we can create an inclusive, accessible, and protective nature-based shoreline, for your community. Here are the next steps for this project. We are going to the Alameda City Council on January 21st. As I said, the City of Oakland and the Port of Oakland also have important adaptation projects underway, and the team is currently pursuing various state and federal grants for green infrastructure design and implementation, and we're pursuing grant funding to support advancing this shoreline concept from conceptual design, which is 10%, to 30% design, which gets us to the step where we can engage the environmental permitting agencies. And now I think there's going to be another survey.
Awesome. Thank you for that presentation. We just want to do a check with everyone by doing a survey just to see how people feel about the information provided. So I'll launch the survey and leave that open for a little bit for folks to fill out as we prepare to land this plane. In the meantime, I think we have a few questions coming into the Q&A box for folks to review, and we can potentially look at that in the next portion. So give me a few seconds for folks to respond, and I'll give you a 30-second warning before we close this. So please help us collect some information on how we've been doing. We're only at 12% participation. All right, the number's ticking up.
Victor, if people want to provide additional feedback outside of the survey, how would you recommend that they do that?
Yeah, I think the best place to email us would be OAAC, that's OAAC @greenbelt.org. That is where we intake all questions and forms. And our team at Greenbelt monitors that inbox diligently. And this is going to be the 30-second warning. Please fill out that survey before we close out. Thank you.
And maybe I'll get us started on responding to some of our questions, just because we got a ton of really awesome questions in the chat that I think we'll have plenty to get through. But yeah, if people want to keep working on your survey in the background, that's fine too. All right, so I'm going to start kind of more or less at some of the first questions that we received, but try to compile them thematically as much as I can. So we received a few questions about groundwater and soil contamination. And one question about what soil remediation is. So I think if one of our presenters just could speak to that issue within the estuary, Oakland Alameda more broadly, that would be great. What is soil remediation? What's supposed to, what are we going to do about contamination, and what role does that play in the current project?
totally. I'll start, and somebody else can chime in as they like. You know, these areas of Alameda and Oakland were previously industrial, so there were many previous uses through there that could have caused contamination. And in the past, when sea levels were not rising, it was an acceptable practice sometimes to bury contamination and cap it in the soil on a site. And so definitely we're all aware that there is contamination still in the soil. But as there is groundwater rise and that groundwater, the water starts moving through those contaminants, the contaminants can then move around. And so then when we say soil remediation, the easiest way I could describe it is if it's a really bad contaminant and it shouldn't be there, that part of the project would be that it would need to be moved somewhere else. And that is one way that contamination is dealt with, and it is very expensive. But that's one of the easiest ways to think about it. I don't know if Philip or Chris may want to talk about more complicated ways to think about it.
No, yeah, I mean, there's no choice, you know, there are all
Yes.
kinds of regulations that will need to be complied with, city regulations, water board regulations, BCDC regulations.
Yeah.
All of them, yeah, you know, will need to be complied with, or you just wouldn't be able to do the adaptation. Yeah.
Right. And it's not really like one of our highest goals here is like doing the right thing. And it would not be the right thing to allow those contaminants back into the bay and negatively affect the health of the bay and negatively affect the health of humans living in these areas.
Well, I think that the realization of how much sea level rise and rising groundwaters could impact some of these contaminated sites is really pretty new. But the EPA's Department of Toxic Substances Control that really oversees a lot of the contaminated sites, as well as the water board, they're both jumping in to try and understand how the regulations need to change. The EPA is starting a new working group trying to look at what that regulatory framework needs to look like. So, you know, my hope is that we'll have a lot more answers on how that we need to address these issues when we actually start, you know, needing to move dirt and construct projects. Because I think, yeah, right now it often feels like more uncertainties and unanswered questions when it comes to rising groundwater and contamination. But there are a lot of great minds trying to work on it.
Great, thank you all. So we received a few questions about ecology and nature-based solutions. So first question is, historically, marshlands have protected us from flooding. Are there plans to add back some of the marshlands that were removed in the past 150 years? And then I think a related question, let me find this. Can you share a little bit more on shoreline cleanup needed to implement some of these nature-based solutions, or the need to excavate debris and contamination prior to implementing adaptation? And then as part of this question as well, that I think gets us in a slightly different direction, how will the existing tide gate at Lake Merritt Channel be considered?
Okay.
Yeah. Jamie, are you going to take that on first?
I'll first just say something about the project we shared today, right, is a near-term protection project that is very focused on these flooding in these areas. So I'm actually the sub-regional project, which is the sub-regional long-term adaptation plan, definitely has ideas about bigger wetland and marsh restoration opportunities in it. It's looking at the whole sub-region, and it's looking at bigger areas where there's more room to do that kind of thing. Just for the estuary project, again, we're trying to make sure we are protecting the Posey and Webster tubes to kind of protect your access to and from Alameda. And those areas are somewhat constrained and not necessarily the best place to put a marsh. Dane, do you want to say anything else about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's good questions. I would say, you know, I think as a lot of people will understand, it's very difficult to go and infeasible really to go back to the 1800s condition, but there's a lot that we can improve. So it's like, even if we can't bring back hundreds and hundreds and thousands of acres of marsh, we can do a lot to improve the connectivity of habitats along the shoreline. And so I think the strategy we're trying to pursue is one where we have space available to pull back, to add more habitat on the shoreline that's currently armored. We're going for that, and then we're also looking more broadly at how can we connect all these habitats in a meaningful way, which is one of the things that's been a goal for this region for a while.
And I would say there will be more thinking on some of that when we do the sub-regional adaptation plan workshops early next year. Dane, do you want to talk about soil contamination and habitat restoration as well as the tide gate?
Well, I would say, like, I'll piggyback off of the answer for the last one a little bit, just in that I think that when there's room to move back, absolutely there would have to be an effort there to look at contamination and removal first.
Mm-hmm.
The tide gate, I'm not sure I'm the best answer on the hydraulics aspect of that, but I would say we're definitely looking at the sides of the channel as opportunity areas, especially to the extent that we can work with the city of Oakland when there's opportunities that arise for areas just to the west or the east, where we would want to pair a project with those improvements to maybe lay back the shoreline if we can, or at least improve the slope and add marshes where we can in those places.
Yeah, and I think Dilip could talk about the tide gate a little bit hydraulically, but I think one thing to keep in mind specifically in this area is that there already is a floodgate at 7th Street, a little bit further up Lake Merritt Channel. So the freshwater, saltwater hydrology of the channel has already been dramatically changed, and is pretty disconnected. What do you say, Dilip?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good summary. The choices at this point are, there are bridges in the way, there's railroads in the way. And so even if we were to fix the shoreline on both sides of Lake Merritt Channel, those are still vulnerable. And there still is an entry point for floodwaters to continue along, the rail line and those corridors. And so a tide gate now a tide gate may seem that the 7th Street gate could become redundant, but I don't think that would be, because the 7th Street gates are very specifically managed for water quality and tidal control within the lake itself for a variety of reasons. This would be a supplemental gate, which would be operable or operational only in advance of a really high tide and a storm surge. So in most cases, it would be open during all tides. Future king tides, yes, those are the times when they would be closed, and then it would be back open after the high tide subsides.
This is Jan from the Port of Oakland. Just want to mention this is a multi-jurisdictional area, so there are different agencies that have jurisdiction here. These are often the most challenging projects to move forward because different folks have different mandates and they don't always overlap neatly. So, besides whether we can actually make it happen, there's also the legal issues as well. So just wanted to throw that extra monkey wrench in there.
We just received a question, what is a tide gate? I think it would be helpful if we could describe that in a little bit more clarity.
Yeah, so in this case, the one that is shown on the left in blue dash, the tide gate would be a structure that would block the water from the bay to go up within Lake Merritt itself. Now, again, it's not all the water, but it is to prevent the upper portion from reaching the same elevation as the bay, right? So it would be very similar to how Lake Merritt is controlled right now. Even when you have a king tide, Lake Merritt doesn't see a king tide. So that would be the kind of structure here that would meter the amount of water that can go north of the tide gate itself. Again, like I said, it is operational only when you need it. For most other, throughout the year, it would be open until such time that you need to close it again, when you have a really high tide.
Thanks, Dilip. So we have a few questions, I think generally about, how this project is coordinating with other work that's happening in the area. So how much input do we have regarding how developers along the Oakland Alameda shorelines design and build shoreline developments? I think we could speak to that specifically in terms of kind of adaptation guidelines. And then another question about DPAVE Park. So are we working in coordination with DPAVE Park? I think we could expand that to talk more broadly about some of the other park development or redevelopment work that's happening in the area.
Do you want me to start, and Danielle or Gail, do you want to chime in? Yeah. Well, as part of this project, we will, need to make some recommendations that will, work their way through the process that sets up planning policies so that other redevelopment projects, know about this information and know their projects need to address this. So, for example, I described the shipways redevelopment is already looking at redeveloping and elevating to the same coastal flood protection elevation, similar with Estuary Park. And so all of the projects that are right in the region where we're working, we're pretty knowledgeable about them, and we're coordinating with those teams about that work. I would say going forward, I think there definitely would need to be more information that is kind of written into the city's policies to address this. This is all a pretty new science here.
I'll just add, thanks, Jamie, that City of Alameda already does have requirements for development on the shoreline that they protect to 2 feet of sea level rise currently, and have plans and space to adapt to future levels of sea level rise. As Jamie mentioned, we are evaluating what additional policies and requirements we may need to implement related to the current science and projections for our shoreline development. And then I think I heard a question specifically about coordinating with DPAVE Park, and we are definitely doing that. Some of those projects that are outside of this current planning area that we're showing tonight, and then last night at Bay Farm Island, will be reflected in the long range plan that we're developing. And we are in coordination with many of those projects that are happening along the shoreline.
Great, thank you, Danielle. Okay, we have about 5 minutes left for questions. So I'm going to do my best to get us through a few more. So we have a question about, I would say, climate justice and kind of the East Oakland neighborhood. What is the focus on community equity and providing more resources for low-income BIPOC residents and communities in East Oakland, historically ignored by agencies and urban planning initiatives? I would say, Gail, do you want to respond to that?
And in the Q&A, I answered that, and just that's part of another project or 2 different projects. One is for a specific neighborhood in East Oakland, Columbian Gardens. We did include it as part of a FEMA brick grant that's also with Bay Farm Island and Doolittle Drive. And so I did include that link. And then just in general, sub-regional adaptation plan includes East Oakland, both on this initial efforts, and you'll see more public engagement next year on that, as well as ports effort. And that's a stage 2 effort, and that's rolling out probably with community engagement. What do you say, Jan? Maybe more like 2026. Is that correct?
Yeah, so our project is called the Climate Adaptation Planning for Oakland's Frontline Communities. So we cover storms and groundwater intrusion in East Oakland and West Oakland and along the 880 corridor. So we're going to be doing quite a bit of public engagement. We're starting our modeling for these, and we're modeling the neighborhoods as well. So we'll have better projections for how storms will look in these neighborhoods. The modeling starts next year. We'll probably begin public outreach summer or fall of next year. It'll be a multi-step approach, introducing the project and then showing results, working on an adaptation strategy and a vulnerability analysis. So those are all independent steps that where we will be engaging with the community. So that'll be a good opportunity for folks to understand what potential vulnerabilities will be occurring in their communities and what steps can be taken to address them. It's, you know, there won't be any construction as a result of this project. It's a planning level project, but it's a good first step in understanding the potential of vulnerabilities and then working long-term to address them. And that's, you know, the whole process of adaptation, it's not an exact science and it's a long-term process. We don't know when these storms are coming. Obviously, we want to address them, but we, you know, some of the work will be done incrementally and some of it will be done more quickly. But this will be a 3 to 4 year study, and we should get good results and good input, and it's a good starting point.
So we're getting pretty close to time, but I did want to just check in, Victor, with you and Les to see if there's any questions from our Spanish speakers that we want to address.
I haven't seen any questions, but I can, Les can probably also help. Si hay personas en la audiencia que tienen preguntas en español, pueden usar el chat de preguntas para entrarlas y la podemos traducir para nuestro equipo.
Okay, so I think we should probably start wrapping up, but if we do see some questions in the chat, we can bring them up. I will also just note, you know, we have a record of all of your questions, and we will be providing some follow-up information following this presentation, so we can do our best to respond. All right, and I will hand it over to you, Lauren.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Lauren Eisel with Community Action for Sustainable Alameda. I'm one of the partners on the team. And we're just really grateful that you showed up tonight, that you spent some time out of your busy day to listen to what we have to share with you tonight. And we encourage you to stay engaged, to tell your friends and your family about what's going on. We'll need your involvement and input to advance this work as we go forward. These projects will take several years, even a decade at most, to get implemented. So please tap into the OAAC website for further updates, and look at the CASA's Facebook page and Greenbelt Alliance's Facebook page to see further updates. And in the near future, we would love to have you continue to participate with these projects. The City of Alameda is having a commission, will be addressing these projects at the Commission on Persons with Disabilities on December 11th at 6:30, at the Community Planning Board on December 16th at 7 p.m. And the projects will also be presented to the City Council next January, January 21st at 7 p.m. In addition, we have some interesting and fun interactive events coming up. Next week, CASA will be sponsoring a King Tide Walk along with the West End Alliance Arts District and Rhythmics. That's on December 14th, Saturday at Crab Cove at 10 a.m. And our other partners, Ninth Root and Sacred Spaces, will also be hosting some in-person events along the Oakland shoreline in San Leandro Bay coming up next year. And we will be sponsoring a whole bunch of other community workshops in 2025 for these projects as well as the long-term plan. And we'd love to have your continued participation. So thank you so much on behalf of all the community partners. We're really, really grateful that you came. And any and more continued input about these projects is very much welcome, and we would love to hear from you in the future. So thank you very much for attending. We appreciate your attendance.
Thanks, everyone. I think that's all for tonight. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you to all of our speakers.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Jamie is sharing your calendar.
Thank you.
All right, should we just drop off then? Yeah.
Great job, everyone. I think we're good to go.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay, I'm
Take
gonna
care.
stop
Yeah.
recording.
Good job.